Good to see you, my friend.
Good to see you.
We are at the end of a week which has been pretty insane, I think, for the diplomatic side of this war, in the sense of where the two sides have been moving. There was this threat of the Strait of Hormuz being closed, just the past 48 hours ago. That seemed not to be the case. Was that a smoke and mirrors move by the IRGC? Where are we right now?
Look, I think we should. I've lived through this once before up close with the JCPOA talks, obviously, with far less theatrics than we have now because we didn't have an entertainer as president of the United States. But bottom line is, I think we should prepare ourselves that this is going to be a very bumpy ride. There's going to be a lot of threats to walk out, potential walkouts, potential suspensions of the MOU, threats to close the Straits, threats to strike at Israel, threats by the US to do all kinds of things. Trump already has made some threats today. And that's just going to be part of the pulse and rhythm of the next 60 days. I'm not saying that some of those things eventually will not break the negotiations. I think there's obviously that risk. But this is not going to be a straight negotiation. This is not two college buddies trying to come to an agreement on something. These are two countries that have defined each other as enemies for the last 47 years. There's a lot at stake, and there's a lot of political face at stake here as well. So I think we're going to see a lot of those different things. And I would just be very careful, because I think there's going to be a lot of smoke and mirrors. There's going to be a lot of barks, less bite, but it's just because it's part of the negotiations.
I mean, you pick up on the time range of 60 days there, but can we assume even that is the time frame that's even going to happen? Maybe something.
No, I fear, unfortunately, that there's a high likelihood that this will go on longer. I think it would be a huge mistake. I think the Iranians should recognize that the ability of Trump to deliver on some of his promises on sanctions relief, etc., is going to be compromised after the midterm elections. If this ends up going to Inara, meaning that Congress is going to have another 60 days to vote on the matter, then you're losing additional time. So I think it would be very important to make sure that this is done before the 60-day deadline. But oftentimes in these type of negotiations, when you set a deadline, you almost guarantee that it will not be met.
Yeah, but let's cut to the chase, Trita. This entire war, and I'm just going to be blunt here, this entire shit show was based on the fact that the United States, or Trump very specifically, got fed up with the talks, which was trying to deal with these things in the very first place. What on earth is different this time? What because the Iranians have a stronger mandate and a stronger leverage position? Why can we assume that we're not just going to go back to where we were on February 28th, on October 28th?
No, I think that's going to be very different, because at this point, both sides need to get a deal. They need to be able to put this behind them. They need to avoid the worst case scenarios that will follow if the deal is not struck. If talks collapse, and remember, throughout that entire period, the talks never collapsed. Negotiations began. There was a lot of ups and downs. There were even exchange of fire, pretty significant ones, but the talks never collapsed. If talks do collapse and it's a complete return to war, it will be a disaster for everyone, including everyone else in the international community, because of the impact it will have on the global economy. And it will be much worse, most likely, this time around. So I think there's structural factors that are really pushing them in the direction of making a deal. It still doesn't mean that it's guaranteed. Still doesn't mean that it will be easy. But I think we're in a scenario in which you can genuinely ask any critic of this deal in Washington, what's your alternative? All the alternatives that are being pointed out right now is that the US should go back into war, full-fledged, and even potentially use nuclear weapons. I mean, you have to recognize how desperate the situation is if the nuclear option is even considered.
Sure, but again, I still don't feel satisfied with that response, because this entire war was based on the premise of the United States and the Iranians trying to negotiate a deal over the nuclear-enriched uranium back in February and January, right? We've had secret talks between them that have been indirectly managed, but between the Omanis for years. Why suddenly is this time different? How can we guarantee that the United? I'll be blunt, right? I personally think that the Trump administration is more likely to be a risk, or the Israelis are the ones that are going to risk this, and therefore the Iranians are like, well, we pull out because we cannot accept the terms given to us because the Israelis are trying to sabotage or jeopardize this situation. Why should we continue with this? Why can we confidently guarantee that these talks are going to actually yield something that they wouldn't have done 6 months ago?
Well, no one can guarantee that, but bottom line is the circumstances are dramatically different. Before February 27th, the military option had not been tried, and the United States thought that the threat of it or the exercise of it would give the United States massive amount of leverage. Now, after 25 years of debating it, it's been tried, and as you said, it was a shit show. It was a complete failure. This war was not won, this war was lost. That creates a completely new situation. And the United States is not in a position to just completely walk away. I think earlier on, there actually was a possibility for them to do so, but then Trump entangled himself further into this with the blockade, etc. And at this point, he just cannot simply walk away. From the Iranian side, at the same time, what would be the value of all of this infliction of a strategic defeat on the United States, if it doesn't translate into a scenario that creates a new situation, a new balance, a new equilibrium in which the sanctions are lifted, Iran is decontained, it has an ability to rebuild itself, and this new order is uncontested, and as a result, Iran is accepted into the region. I mean, that's what these wars ultimately are fought for, to be able to get yourself to a new, much more attractive, uncontested balance. That only happens at the negotiating table. It doesn't happen on the battlefield. At the battlefield, you create the circumstances or the context and the structure of the situation. But then the rest of it has to be done at the negotiations. And that's why the Iranians are there. They're not there because they're in a weak position. They're there because they think of themselves as being in a strong position. And now they're trying to translate the battlefield victories into this new political equilibrium that is crucial for them to achieve.
Mm. I mean, look, I have my personal distinctions and then my role as host to challenge you on certain things, right? My personal perspective is that the Iranians are in a far more comfortable position than they ever have been, and they're far more competent as negotiators and diplomatic players, strategic players than anyone, I think, the US administration at least has given them credit for. But in this regard, therefore, we're now in a situation where the Iranians seem to have the leverage, but they don't necessarily have free reign, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
They still have certain limitations. There are distinctions between members of the government itself, for example. From my understanding, there's been disagreements between the parliamentary senior speakers and, say, Mujtaba and some of his inner circle. I understand there's distinctions there, let alone the United States and the basket case that represents the United States administration right now. So if we're going to see an extended period of diplomatic engagement, what does that mean in terms of what concessions will we see more? Because the United States, I'll give you an example. So the United States were very quick earlier today to say, we have guaranteed that the Iranians will be relinquishing their enriched uranium. Well, as far as I remember, that was one of the basic expectations of the MOU. So nothing's really changed in that regard. But the US is trying to frame it as some kind of great win. So is this just where we're going to go? That the US tries to frame lots of big wins and actually it's just a slightly refrained or enhanced version of what was originally agreed?
I think we need to take a step back and remember the MOU only sets the parameters of what a final deal can look like. Mm-hmm. And part of it that it doesn't spell out is exactly what type of nuclear concessions the Iranians will give. It sets the parameters for the sanctions relief. Essentially says all sanctions are going to be on the table. But we can't make a judgment as to whether this is a good or a bad deal, if the Trump administration completely backed down on a lot of things or not, until we know what the final deal is. And we won't know for at least another 60 days. And as you pointed out earlier on, it probably will take longer. But I do think that from the Iranian standpoint, the objective has always been to keep their right to enrich and that technological scientific knowledge while getting decontained, meaning completely break free from the shackles of sanctions that has been put on their economy over the course of decades. And you were absolutely right when you earlier on said this is their best position ever vis-a-vis the United States to strike a good deal. And what you have to approach in that type of a situation is you can either go out and say, okay, what is the minimum that I'm willing to give or maximum I'm willing to give? Or what is the maximum that I'm willing to receive from the other side, or a minimum that I want to receive? And they can go at this and try to get some sort of a small deal, try to reduce their nuclear concessions as much as possible and get much less. Or they can think, as long as we keep the minimum of the nuclear program there and an acknowledgement that they have a right and they will continue to enrich uranium, you can give up almost everything else and see what type of a sanctions relief you get. And this is what I think is going to be interesting to see in the next 60 days. I think there's some people who have really committed themselves to the idea that the Iranians always were just looking for a nuclear weapon. I don't think that ever was the case. The entire approach of their conduct was to enhance nuclear capabilities in order to gain more leverage at a negotiation in order to get sanctions lifted. But they were never going to give up the entire program, and they didn't need to. But they wanted to have as much leverage as possible to get as much of the sanctions away as possible. And if you compare what they're willing to give now, or what we know at least happened in February, and the type of sanctions relief they can get now, they're in a position to get far more sanctions relief, even for significantly more nuclear concessions compared to the JCPOA.
Yeah, I think on your point about the relationship to nuclear enrichment and generally the nuclear program, I think it's always been rather simplistic in sort of assuming that they were hell-bent on wanting this warhead. I think it underestimates the long-termism of the system and certainly those at the upper echelons of power. But what I do find interesting is that both sides seem to have different emphases right now. And what I mean by that is on the Iranian side, it's all about Lebanon. What I think has been fascinating, it kind of brings me back to an article that you'd written a week and a half ago when they launched the strikes, which was they are acting on behalf of another state, or they're acting on behalf of another third party. I think we touched upon it in another conversation. But on the American side, it's all about the sanctions relief. It's all about the financial side, at least for Donald Trump. Perhaps that's reflective of his general approach to foreign policy. But how do you think that these two find not even a middle ground, but like an approach to discussing such different things? Because the Americans are clearly becoming disenfranchised with the Israelis over Lebanon, but not as enough of a priority as it is for the Iranians to want to discuss that as point number one. Does that make sense?
I don't think that it makes sense, but I don't think that's where they've landed. I think the US side has committed itself for the Israelis to be out of Lebanon and completely stop the fighting. It's just that it's how is it going to be phased? They're not going to be out on the day of the MOU signage, which is already passed at this point. But towards the end of this agreement, the Israelis are not going to be in Lebanon, or there is no agreement. I'm 100% certain of that. The Iranians are not going to sign on to anything. Their red line on Lebanon is not a pink line. It is not a joke. It is not. It is something that is dead set for them for a very simple reason. Lebanon and the strength of Hezbollah there is their first line of defense. They are trying to reestablish their forward defense. In 2006, when the Israelis went to war with Hezbollah, I ran into the Deputy Defense Minister of Israel at a conference, and we spoke on the sidelines. And he told me, and I've quoted in my book, I quoted him on my Substack, that Lebanon and Hezbollah is just a prelude. The war will inevitably go to Iran, but first Hezbollah needs to be defeated. But because Israel failed to defeat Hezbollah in 2006, there was no war between Israel and Iran in 2006. That war happened in 2024, 2025, 2026, precisely because Hezbollah, the Assad regime had fallen, Hezbollah had been significantly weakened, and Iran's forward defense essentially had been significantly penetrated. So the forward defense proved its utility. It held for 20 years, and now they're trying to reestablish it. Now they're trying to reestablish it while also having a deal with the United States. But if it comes to choosing between a deal with the United States or the forward defense, I would put my bet on the forward defense. They're not going to trust the piece of paper signed by Trump as much as they will trust how a strong Hezbollah will make it much, much more difficult for the Israelis to attack Iran. And the Iranians have also said, and I think it was a very important statement, their deterrence is not any longer going to be inside of Iran, meaning they're going back to this forward defense in which they will have their deterrence outside of their own territory to ensure that the war never comes to Iran's territory. And for 20 plus years, it was successful. And now they're seeing the opportunity to rebuild that, and they will trust that more than a deal with the US. If they can have both, which is what they're aiming for, obviously that is optimal. But if they have to choose, I think they will choose the forward defense.
Interesting. Makes me think of what the Europeans are trying to do with NATO and the forward defense deterrence regarding Russia in the East. But when we think about this then in the context of Iran's perspective, what does this tell us about their mindset then? If they're putting so much emphasis on Hezbollah and that part of this, well, perhaps you'd still think it's the Shia Crescent, but does that demonstrate therefore that the Iranians have seen a significant deterioration of the proxy network? Whether or not you believe that they have a proxy network, or use that terminology, but like they lost a couple of entities that were quite important. So the fact that they're putting so much emphasis on keeping their flagship proxy, is that a demonstration that they are still quite vulnerable after everything?
I think they were very vulnerable before the war. I think the war has now restored their own deterrence. They're now going for extended deterrence and forward defense. Will everything rely on this going forward? Well, it depends on if other arrangements are made. If there is an effort for a completely inclusive security architecture in the region in which Iran is included, and which measures are taken for all countries in the region, not to use groups like Hezbollah or others. Because it's very important to understand, it's not just the Iranians. Look what the Emiratis are doing throughout the Horn of Africa, in Sudan, what they've done in Libya, and many others, the Turks as well. So this is not just something the Iranians are doing. This is unfortunately part and parcel of how most states in the region are operating. Even a small state like Qatar that 15 years ago was doing some of these things. So if there is an arrangement that deals with everyone's usage of these type of tools, then I think there can be a potential dismantlement of that strategy if it's replaced with something that they find trustworthy. And that will be the same bargain that all other states will have to make, whether it's this or whether it's other types of arrangements that they have. But up until then, they're going to rebuild this forward defense. You know, the Axis definitely took some huge hits. There's no doubt about that. But what is the alternative for the Iranians at this point?
Well, I mean, one could argue that they try to go back to what they did in the past. They try to utilize clandestine or asymmetrical methods. I mean, I find that word a little bit overutilized these days. But maybe they try to simply, I don't know, what's the word? Elongate the talks out, right? They don't commit to any one thing, but they don't also say no. So there's sort of like the North Korean situation, South Koreans, there isn't an armistice. So both sides stay at an effective case of war, but nothing ever changes. It's sort of a bit of a limbo period. Or you think that's effectively impossible?
I think those are two completely different things. They can elongate if they think that that is wise for them. I certainly hope they don't, because I think it would be a very big mistake for them to drag these talks out. I think the manner in which Trump can actually give nuclear sanctions concessions is far stronger prior to the midterms. I would not bet on what he can do afterwards. It would be a mistake extending it. But that has very little to do with whether they are going to try to rebuild their forward defense. These are not either or. They're going to do both of these different things.
Well, what about the Strait of Hormuz then? Is this going to be a sanctioned, or not sanctioned, a tolled, monitored maritime stretch of water, which is done so in coordination with the Omanis, the Gulf states, through granting of exceptions that that's the new reality? Or are they going to sort of try to capitulate to the Americans in some way because of, I don't know, third unknown issue that I can't think of? I mean, the French and the British sort of want to help manage the strait, but I don't know how that's going to work in the fact that it's in the background of Iran's. Well,
no, I find it unlikely that the Iranians would give space to the French or the Brits to come in on something like this, even though they have put together a coalition of a lot of countries, but they don't necessarily have the influence of being able to make much of a change here. And they were not a factor in any of these negotiations. This is something happening between the US and Iran primarily. But when it comes to the Strait, again, these are one of those issues that are going to be determined by these negotiations going forward. The Iranians clearly have said that nothing will go back to the way it was before. Whether they can stand by that or not remains to be seen. I think they are going to try very hard to make sure that there is some sort of an arrangement in which there is an environmental or other type of management fee, not a toll, that is charged in conjunction either with Oman or with further regional states. So this is a regional mechanism. I think it would be much easier for the American side to accept it if it is not just Iran and Oman, so that the US side can say that this is not the Iran's controlling the Straits.
Interesting.
So these are things that are going to be determined by the negotiations. I don't think we have a clear vision. And I personally don't think it is I think they're very serious about it, but I can see them given concessions on this issue, depending on what type of sanctions relief is put on the table. Whereas Hezbollah, I don't think is negotiable at all.
No, I agree. I don't think Lebanon and Hezbollah, that entire file, is something that they're willing to even remotely touch on. But what I am interested in, and as someone who's only followed this in the years that they've been active, which is a lot less than you, and a lot less experienced, but I guess something that a lot of people who are only touching upon this or have jumped on the opportunity to sort of develop a sense of substance or career, right? The amount of YouTube channels or certain activities that have come out of the war in Iran in the past few months is insane. But this is the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, Trita, but this is the first time that we've seen not just face-to-face talks between both sides, but at the vice presidential level of that seniority for their respective nation states. What does that mean? Does this mean that we might find an actual systemic solution to the underpinning issues that have predicated much of the Middle East in the past 25, 40 years?
Look, I think it is historic. I mean, look, during the JCPOA, you had Zarif on the same stage with the American diplomats, throughout all of that, and all of the other diplomats as well. So they were talking face to face. They were talking just the two of them. They were going on walks in the parks in Vienna because they got tired of just sitting in those hotel rooms. So that is not a breakthrough. But to have the vice president do it, this is a level higher than what we saw in the JCPOA. They were on the same stage together. They didn't shake hands in front of the cameras, at least. So the Iranians still have deprived them from that type of a photo op that I think the American side very much likes to see and likes to have. But we're clearly going in that direction. And again, there's no more fuss about talking directly to the American side and to do so directly with the vice president. It happened as well in Islamabad, of course. But we're seeing a lot of taboos being broken down in real life. You just take a look at the signing of the MOU. It was signed by the president of the United States and the president of Iran, both of them posting pictures of themselves doing so on Twitter. There was no signing of the JCPOA. It was not a document that was signed by either side in the same way. And if it was, there were certain things that were signed, but those were signed by the foreign ministers, not by the presidents. I think the Iranians wanted Trump to sign this. This was a way for them to see that he was really committing himself to it, that he would not keep a certain distance away from it and say, well, this is J.D. Vance's deal, so he could just throw J.D. Vance and the MOU under the bus if it didn't work out for him. Now he's really owning it. He signed it. He signed it in the Versailles. So I think there's a lot of taboos, etc., that are just being broken to the point that we cannot even keep count any longer.
So you said, or I think shared the point that J.D. Vance is effectively changing the whole entire paradigm. I think that's what you said. And to be honest, based on some of the things that he's talking about, he keeps emphasizing, correct me if I'm wrong, Trita, but he keeps emphasizing that the US and Israeli governments they're just differing, they're diverging on so many points. Is this the end of this unique relationship. Special relationship as a Brit is what I think of the UK-US relationship. But is this the end of the US-Israeli relationship as we know it because of this issue?
I think the US side is either beginning to despecialize the US-Israel relationship, or at least they're threatening to despecialize it. Because as you said, JD is constantly emphasizing that there are diverging interests. He is also degrading the relationship with Israel because he made that statement that they're good partners, similar to the way that the UK and France are. That is a significant step down for the Israelis, who have always viewed that they have a very special relationship with the United States that no other state can touch. And yes, the Brits believe that they have a special relationship with the US. I don't think anyone in the US system, even before the Trump administration, believes so.
Not really.
But it's a belief that I'm sure gives the UK a lot of comfort. But to put Israel in the same category as the UK and France is not to put them in an enemy category, but it is nowhere near the category that the Israelis believed they were at and that they should be at. And if that ends up becoming normalized, then you have the despecialization of that relationship. And I don't think it is a coincidence that JD is speaking in this way. They're really putting pressure on the Israelis. I don't think anything has been said or done that is irreversible, but it's clearly signaling the direction that they are traveling right now. And it is clearly making sure that it should be clear to everyone who is the superpower in this relationship and who has the leverage. Because of the lack of backbone of previous American presidents, the type of leverage that needs to be exerted on Israel by the United States when it is crashing through American red lines was never used, was never exercised. And this may have created a perception in the world, in Washington itself, in Israel, that the US doesn't have or is not willing to use that leverage. We're now seeing signs from the Trump administration that they are willing to use it. Whether they fully do so remains to be seen. Whether they stick to this line remains to be seen. And to a certain extent, it depends on what happens in the negotiations. If the negotiations go badly and this whole thing crashes, yes, of course, the US is going to go back to the previous relationship it had with Israel. But if it goes well, then I suspect that the administration is going to continue to push this line. And if the Israelis are trying to sabotage it, then the US side is going to continue to inflict a cost on the Israelis for that type of sabotage. And much of that will be to degrade it from having been that special relationship to something different. And if they continue even further, perhaps next time JD Vance will say that, Israel is a great partner, just as much as Albania is a great partner of the United States.
I mean, I was chuckling earlier because of the special relationship, because it is always such an emphasis in the UK about the special relationship and the depth and meaningfulness of the UK to the US. But frankly, no one in Washington, considering the several years that I was there, gives a monkeys about it. Also, I see not a monkey, but I think a doggo running behind you, which looks very sweet. But I think somewhere just around there. But you've written quite a lot of interesting points about, I think, the direction of the talks in a hypothetical, and now we're actually seeing the atmosphere. And just looking at what you've written on your Substack notes, which, to be fair, everyone on YouTube, we are streaming to Substack more and more these days.
Oh, exactly. Yeah,
it's
a great platform.
Yeah, no, do check out Trita's work on there. Do follow me on there if you're interested, and vice versa. If you enjoy the YouTube stuff, then of course cross platforms, it's important. But anyway, bottom line is, you had posted a few hours ago about the idea of the atmosphere being cordial and constructive. Is that because of the scale at which we're seeing things, because of the seniority, or is it just because of the implications associated with what's happening?
No, I spoke to someone who's very close to the negotiations. I won't say on which side of what really was going on, and this is again very typical. There were times in which there were very strong statements coming from both sides, the US side, the Iranian side, the European side during the JCPOA, giving the impression that talks were going badly, or were collapsing, or that there was that they were tense and unconstructive, and in reality was something else at the negotiating table. And what I was told is that despite all of the noise, despite the threats, etc., at the negotiating table, progress was being made. They were cordial and constructive. But they were also running into significant challenges, Hezbollah and Lebanon and Israel being one of them, of course. But progress was being made. And of course, I think from the US side, it would have been much better from their standpoint to actually have that photo op. I don't think the Iranians are going to give it to the American side too soon, too easy. This is part of their psychological game and their use of symbolism to assert their leverage in their mind, perhaps their dominance. And again, this is just part of the negotiations. It was the same thing before. It's just a little bit on crack these days compared to before.
Not a term I expected you to hear to use, Peter, but all right. So what are we going to expect in the next few days then? We're going to see just going through the motions, pleasantries, diplomatic dialogues. I've been on plenty of ends of backdoor diplomacy or sitting in the back part of the room whilst the actual negotiations happen, a table in front of me, and the sort of intensity that you can feel, the subtle tension that exists within people when they're sitting across from the table, and how much the testosterone, or perhaps a little bit more, exists in such a small amount of space, right? So what can we expect?
The most important thing I think we will see is, I would look at three things. One, I would look at the rhetoric coming out of the Iranians, how they describe the talks. I will look at whether JD is going to continue to push back as aggressively and as firmly as he's done, both against detractors in Washington, against Israel. And I will most importantly take a look at what happens in Lebanon. Because as I said before, yes, the Israelis may not be out of Lebanon at the signing of the MEU, but at some point during these next 60 days, it's supposed to be a phased withdrawal out of Lebanon. Otherwise, a ceasefire would essentially cement Israel's new occupation and presence in Lebanon. And obviously, that's not going to be accepted. But what was supposed to happen is that as soon as the MOU is signed, it is supposed to be a situation in which there is no longer active fighting between the two sides. We've already seen a little bit of a violation of that. If that starts to become normalized, and we see that this ceasefire turns into another one of these Swiss cheese ceasefires that we've seen imposed on the Israelis by the US in Gaza or elsewhere, then I think that's going to end up becoming a significant problem. And then we may see measures by the Iranians, whether they suspend the MOU or take other types of measures to put pressure in order to ensure that there is a complete end of the fighting. From the US side, there's also a lot of criticisms because they don't believe that the Iranians have held back Hezbollah hard enough to make sure that Hezbollah is not restarting things. So from both sides, there's going to be a challenge here, but there's supposed to be a real ceasefire. And if there isn't one in Lebanon, that's going to be the biggest challenge.
Yeah, but let's be honest. This is an intention of this ultra-nationalist government, Trita, to physically occupy and retain, more importantly, the southern quarters of Lebanon. You agree?
Definitely. The Israeli intent is not a secret. They're very public about it. They want to annex parts of Lebanon just as much as they have now started to annex parts of Syria. They already annexed the Golan, which was just supposed to be a buffer zone, and now they have a buffer zone for the buffer zone, and they're going to try to do the same thing in Lebanon. And that's exactly why the Iranians are not going to compromise on this issue, because if they do, you will end up with a degree of Israeli annexation of Lebanese territory. And that would just be a recipe for further warfare in the region. The Lebanese are not going to accept that. Hezbollah is never going to accept that its territory is going to be taken. We saw years of fighting over these type of issues. So, and I think the US side also recognizes if it wants to be able to say that we actually got a peace and that the situation is stable now and that this was a major achievement, they cannot allow for a wound like southern Lebanon to remain open. It has to be fixed. So I think the US side is actually very serious about it. The question is, are they synchronized when it comes to the scheduling, how it's going to be phased, etc.? It's going to require a lot of pressure on Israel from the United States, and that's going to be costly for the administration. It's not something that they believe they can just do by wandering some sort of waving a magic wand. But I do believe that if they get really serious about putting pressure on the Israelis, withdrawing arms sales, stopping to protect them politically and diplomatically at the UN, this could actually end very quickly. As you recall, when Ronald Reagan had that conversation with Menachem Begin in 1982, and he was deeply upset about what the Israelis were doing in Lebanon, southern Lebanon, again, even called it a Holocaust, which of course Menachem Begin took great exception to. Nevertheless, after the threat of withholding arms sales, and particularly I think was F-16s at the time, it took 20 minutes, and Menachem Begin called back and said that the Israelis are withdrawing. So it absolutely can be done. And I suspect, frankly, that it will be done because this MOU and this deal is too important for the United States to let the Israelis to sabotage. Remember what J.D. Vance also said. He said the Israelis cannot kill themselves out of every problem. That is a very, very harsh critique that goes at the very core of what seems to be the center of Israeli national security strategy for the last couple of years, if not longer.
When I hear such a statement like that, it makes me think of sort of what the Kremlin's trying to do with its own civilians in the war in Ukraine. Goodness. Mm-hmm. I guess, Trita, just to sort of wrap this up in a couple of questions, but so let's assume that the talks go relatively smoothly then. And there is progress.
No, they will not go smoothly. I mean, they may succeed, but they will not go smoothly. I want to make sure that I was not misunderstood in any way, shape, or form.
No,
it's going to be a very, very bumpy ride.
But what define bumpy though? Well, what we see more flare-ups?
Everything that we've seen during the run-up to the MOU, during the last couple of days, in which this meeting was delayed 2 or 3 days until the last minute. It wasn't known or clear whether J.D. Vance would be part of the delegation. All of that's probably one of the least problematic bumps compared to other things that were going to come up. And it's going to be the nature of this negotiation because they're not negotiating a trade deal. They're not negotiating something small. If this is successful, this will redefine the entire Middle East.
Yeah, but how much of this is performative, Trita? How much of this is the Trita was a Trita?
Yeah.
Vance wasn't planning to go, and then suddenly here's how much.
No. A lot of the bumps are performative. There's no doubt about that. Absolutely, but that's part of what I'm saying. It's part of the negotiations. The Iranians will, refuse to come because Trump tweeted something, or there may be several different things that happen. Also, on the U.S. side, measures of that kind may be taking place. But I think we have to understand the negotiations do not just take place at the negotiating table. Everything else is also part of the negotiations.
All right. Very last question, I guess, for you, Trita. I mean, I could talk to you for hours, but I'm sure you have plenty more.
I have other things to do. I hope you do too.
Well, I mean, it's 12:30 for me here, but I stayed up after a lovely sunny day here because this is very important as part of my schedule is to talk to you, genuinely meaning that, which is simply what would you encourage people as someone who talks about this? When you look at things, what should we be looking at as the general public who don't have the information that you have access to? How do we make assessment of what's happening?
First of all, separating the noise from the actual important signals is very, very tricky. There's not a single formula for it, in my view, because it very much depends on the situation and the context. But a lot of these different things, such as, I got a lot of press inquiries as to whether the talks are collapsing just because they didn't happen on the Saturday and ended up happening on the Sunday. I mean, people really need to calm down because otherwise they're all going to get heart attacks. Because again, a lot of these stuff is going to happen. And again, it was like this as well at times during the JCPOA, but this is far more intense. The time is much more squeezed in. But the biggest thing I would look at is trying to get an understanding. What are the real core interests and the real red lines? I think the Strait of Hormuz is very, very important to them. But ultimately, look at what they're saying. They're saying that the strait will not go back to what it was before. Fine. That can be many different scenarios. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's just a toll or an environmental fee. It could be many different things. It still would be different from what it was from February 27th. But when it comes to Lebanon, etc., I think it's much clearer. When they're saying that Iran's defenses will never again be inside of Iran, its deterrence will no longer be inside of Iran, it means that they are dead serious about the forward defense. So to be able to try and understand, the gradation, the shades of what is really a red line and what is something that, they may fluff up a little bit because it's part of the negotiation. And I think there you can see that even something as important as the Strait of Hormuz is nevertheless a formulation that is not as categorical as it is when it comes to Lebanon, for instance. So if you see things go badly in Lebanon, yes, that's something that would absolutely risk the whole thing collapsing.
Yeah, and I would double underline that for viewers. In my limited knowledge of the region, I think it's pretty clear that Lebanon and the Israeli activities, for lack of a better word, around there are the preeminent factor into how well these talks go. But Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute and a regular on the Global Gambit. Always a pleasure, my friend. I'm very delighted.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And everyone, obviously go and subscribe to Trita. What are you doing if you haven't? And subscribe to me as well. But we'll see you all very soon. Take care.
Thank you.